so please help me welcome John, Hector, Garnette, and Diego.
Hi. Thanks for coming. I guess, does anybody want to know the Dodgers score? No? Yes. Dodgers are up 3-1 in the 7th. So now that that's out of the way, we can,
baseball, right?
Yes. It's not cricket. I thought I'd talk a little bit about what this issue's for, and it's actually more connected to the anthology that she just mentioned, Tales of Two Americas. Right now, 27 people in the United States have a net worth which is equal to roughly half of the United States. So 27 people could fit in these chairs, and their income is equal to half of the people that live in this country. We live in an era of bewildering social inequality, economic inequality, and simultaneously in the literary world we also live in a time of extreme nationalism. Even if you don't believe in things like the quote-unquote Muslim ban and some of the nationalistic rhetoric that's coming from this current government, only 3% of our books are translated in this country, and that's a huge impoverishment, especially considering that the U.S. is more diverse than it's ever been in its history. And so there's a wealth of information in the lives and in the bodies of people around this country, and there's a wealth of information and stories in the lives and bodies in the body of work of people outside this country. And so my hope was, with these two anthologies, is to put them together and to think that maybe what we could do is imagine what's right in front of us. Imagine the possibility of being another person, and whether or not it's someone born across town, rather than in your own home, as Hector does in his piece in Tales of Two Americas. In one of his earliest pieces in the LA Times, he writes about tragically a young boy who was killed in a drive-by shooting, who was the exact same age as his own son, living in a town very adjacent to the town that he and his family were living in. And it's simultaneously Diego Enrique Osorno is writing about how a town in Mexico, which is the victim of some of the worst narco violence in all of Mexico, is trying to resurrect itself by hosting an attempt to build the world's largest shrimp cocktail and win the Guinness World Book of Records for that attempt. And so what these writers are doing is trying to cut through spectacle by watching and observing and thinking about what's right in front of them. In his piece, Garnette Cadogan is writing about growing up in Jamaica in a difficult home and escaping into the twin heroes of Bruce Lee and Charlie Brown. And in the course of this piece, he decides that neither of them is going to be his way out of this difficult home. It's going to be a third way, the trickster Anansi. And so in the pieces of these three writers, we have a crime story turned inside out. We have a folk tale turned inside out. And we have a piece of municipal spectacle turned inside out. And so across the pieces in this anthology, but more this one, I'm watching writers play with form and use, whether it's nonfiction or poetry or fiction, use forms to get at what's right in front of us. So I just wanted to give you that preamble before asking some questions of these guys. And since Diego has come the furthest, if you can't tell by his coffee, I want to ask you, and you can speak in a mixture of English and Spanish, and Hector will chip in. What are the challenges to seeing and describing what is right in front of you in Mexico right now?
Sí, ¿cuál es el desafío ahora en escribir sobre la realidad mexicana, lo que ves ahora? ¿Cuáles son los desafíos en eso?
En español voy a tener que hablar. Sorry by my bad English. El principal problema que tenemos los narradores de la realidad mexicana es precisamente que estas historias como la que viene en el libro, que parecen de ficción, sean verosímiles.
The biggest challenge that we face as writers is that these stories that are so fantastic from our reality, trying to make them feel real.
En México tenemos el problema de que la realidad tiene más imaginación que la ficción.
Yeah, the problem we have in Mexico is that reality has more imagination than fiction does.
Entonces nosotros escribimos de cosas espeluznantes o tragicómicas como esta, y mucha gente, aún en México, porque México es un país muy desigual, es un país que tiene ciudades que son como Beverly Hills y ciudades que son como los países más pobres del mundo. Entonces en el propio país hay mexicanos que no conocen esta realidad.
And the problem is that we write about things that are so terrifying and so frightening and so crazy, and because Mexico has so much inequality, there are people in Mexico who don't actually even know that these realities exist.
Yo creo que ese es el reto mayor. Obviamente, toda esta situación es una oportunidad narrativa. Yo preferiría no tener esta oportunidad narrativa como persona.
Obviously, that's the biggest challenge, but then all of this reality presents an opportunity for us, a narrative opportunity. I personally would prefer not to have that opportunity.
Hector, I wonder if you can talk about beginning as a reporter in Los Angeles. Hector is the author of 2 novels as well as 2 works of nonfiction, including Deep Down Dark, which is about the Chilean miners who were eventually rescued, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle. But this piece that you wrote for me is kind of like a B-side to a piece that you wrote for the LA Times, and I wonder if you can compare the two, what you were able to write as a reporter and what you gained, or what possibly more you could tell from the story by placing what happened next to your own life.
Well, I think that when you're, there's a professional melodrama factory, and we see it in print. We used to see it in print more. Now it's mostly on cable television. Every time there's a mass shooting, there is an industry and a pattern of telling the story of the mass shooting. And so I was part of that industry. That's where I got my training as a writer, was in this industry of melodrama. And it requires skill. You have to be able to write fast. You have to have great empathy skills. This is why Anderson Cooper is a star. That he can be intelligent, and then he can emote, and he can interview someone who has lost somebody, and make it and feel human. Right, and you feel he's a human being, except for his hair that never moves, and so that's a skill as a writer too, to be able to interview someone who's just lost a child, and have this empathy, and then later to be able to distance yourself and pull back. But it's really, really draining on the soul, and my biggest frustration as that kind of reporter was that I was just telling surface details of stories. And I feel now that mass shootings should only be covered by novelists. It should be an army of novelists and short story writers and poets who should go and cover these mass shootings, because the human complexity and the tragedy and the psychology of the characters' personalities involved in these shootings and of the politics is all so crazy. Like Diego was saying about Mexican reality. And so to me, the process of becoming a novelist has been the process of allowing myself to see all these different textures of reality within even the most melodramatic sort of events. And that to me is the primary difference.
Well, right now we're talking about violence, actual physical violence, rather than necessarily structural violence, like poverty, the disempowerment of people based on who or what they are, the defunding of education. I wonder, Diego, if you could speak about the less flamboyant types of violence that are existing, ongoing in Mexico. which are adjacent to the physical forms of narco-violence. How much of your work is about the invisible violence?
Yo investigué y escribí una biografía de Carlos Slim.
I investigated and wrote a biography of Carlos Slim.
Es uno de los hombres más ricos del mundo. En varios años ha sido más rico que Buffett, que Bill Gates, que Bezos.
He's one of the richest men in the world. In various years, he's been richer than Buffett and Bezos and others. Yes.
En un país donde hay 50 millones de personas que viven con menos de $2 al día.
In a country where there are 50 million people who live with less than $2 a day.
Y descubrí, entre muchas otras cosas, que según incluso estudios oficiales de la OCDE,
¿De la OCDE?
OCDE, Slim, las prácticas monopólicas y abusivas de las empresas de Slim en México perjudicaron el bienestar del país en $129 mil millones.
According to some official studies, that Slim's monopolistic practices, his business practice, have cost Mexico. ¿Cuánto fue la cantidad?
$129 mil millones.
$129 billion.
Whoa.
Eso para mí
That for me,
es una masacre, eso mató gente,
it's a massacre, it's a mass killing,
pero es invisible.
but it's invisible.
Esa violencia es la que a mí también me interesa mostrar.
That violence is also what I'm interested in showing.
En la historia esta que cuento, creo que lo que se refleja es la violencia cultural.
And in the story that I write, what is shown there is the cultural violence.
Esa es otra violencia también, cuando la sociedad asimila o normaliza las masacres.
When a society normalizes and assimilates these massacres.
Y por eso me parecía importante contar esta historia con un cierto sentido irónico.
And that's why it was important to me to tell the story with a certain irony.
Lo peor es que mucha de la gente leyó el artículo y lo celebró y lo presume como un registro del gran acontecimiento que ellos lograron, que es romper el récord del camarón.
And the really sad part is a lot of people in este pueblo, a lot of people in this town celebrate this story and they love it as a celebration of their great achievement, which was to break the Guinness World Record for the largest shrimp cocktail.
Para mí la violencia más difícil de combatir es precisamente esta violencia cultural y esta violencia institucional que representa Slim, más allá de la violencia directa de un asesino.
And for me, that's the hardest thing, is to combat this violence of people like Slim, that's beyond, beyond this physical violence. Hay una expresión en español, en inglés, there's an expression in English que es algo que es algo similar, que se llama mindfuck. Entonces sí, porque es algo violento, ¿no? Es decir, no es hacer el amor, es algo violento, fuck, pero es al cerebro, ¿no? And so, yes, perfect, yes.
Garnette, I want to ask you about this because I think if anybody in the audience here reads fiction, your experience of the forms of violence that have existed in Jamaica, where you're from, may have come from Marlon James's great novel, A Brief History of Seven Killings.
Long History of 700 Killings.
Yeah, that's Garnette's alternate title for the book. Your piece obviously takes an abstract form of violence and brings it to a personal level, but I wonder if you can start on a broader experiential level of growing up in Kingston. You read Marlon's novel, and it's almost comical. There's gangsters with names like Funky Chicken, and there's a kind of haphazard plot to kill Bob Marley. It is. There's a side plot with a CIA operative who's either encouraging or behind this or against it. It's not clear. How would you characterize what Kingston was like in the 1970s? Because as Diego was speaking, Kingston was also a country. It was poor, but it also had some extremely rich people in it. And I wonder if the violence there was primarily organized forms of crime, or if there were other and more invisible things that interest you more, or that are less known that you might want to talk about.
There's an intersection of both, and One of the things I'm obsessed with, as you know, is the ways in which the mundane embodies so much more. The ways in which the mundane are not mundane. The commonplace is deeply complex and in a mirror for the things we like to focus our point on. I think, for example, that given a story before of being in Charlottesville and going to see the Ku Klux Klan march, and on my way to the Ku Klux Klan march, a woman was upset with me in the CVS because I wasn't giving her assistance. I was like, but on any given, if you're black or brown, you know that phenomenon, what they call the lazy employee problem, in which you're in Duane Reade or CVS or Chase or somewhere, and somebody's mad at you for not helping them, except you just don't work there. And so the ways in which the person was upset with me, and then I saw the march, and somebody who was denouncing the Klan afterwards, I had seen her and tell her that her glasses had fallen, and she clutched her handbags and assumed that I was a thief. And so in which what's available to me was that I was either an assailant or a servant. I was only there to cater to you or to assault you. And that lack of imagination, which for me was, the real pervasive problem that was helping to create the kind of environment in which the Klan felt that they were welcome to come to that town. But the focus on the vulgar, on the vulgarity, was a way not to deal with that more pervasive problem. Because for me, the Klan came to town, they did their thing, they were gone half an hour. I never had to see them or deal with them again, and I'd been there for 2 years. But the person who gets annoyed at me not helping them in CVS or in Barnes & Noble or in the bar or in the restaurant or in the pharmacy or in the grocery store, I had to deal with them every single day. To the point where I think that Duane Reade and CVS owe me commission for the amount of help I've given people. Or the person who kept calling the cops because the mere fact of my dark skin was enough reason for alarm. And so that also happened, very much in Jamaica. And I guess I learned to deal with it just, growing up in Jamaica, that there are ways in which that brutal violence was helped to facilitated by the very wealthy, who had, a lot of people had gained their wealth from political connections, and which had divided up the country almost like a chessboard into different political parties, in which these people were called dons, would rule. And so you had election outcomes in which, we didn't have the problem with votings that you have here, where there's not enough people voting. Our problem was that you had 110% of people voting for the same party in districts. And so these political domains, but which were created and propped up and facilitated by very wealthy people who had strong political connections, but left the poor to hash it out with each other in an almost Hobbesian existence. And so I had to deal with quite a bit of that and navigate that growing up. And of course, there was no neutrality in Jamaica. If you get held up with someone with a gun and say, are you JLP or PNP? And I say, I'm neutral. And I said, neutral JLP or neutral GPNP? And so
those are two political parties.
Yeah, two political parties. So there is no neutrality at all. And so I learned to see inequality as something that wasn't so much the vulgar thing, that brutal violence that we kept seeing, but more invisible hand that continually played and was always at work in the midst of that awful violence that made you flinch away. So and always flinch, and I always make sure not to close my eyes, because I know that if I close my eyes I might have seen the very wealthy, the very powerful who stood behind while this happened.
We're talking about political violence, but obviously if we only look through that lens at certain things, we only see the end result of a long series of policies of lives too, and Hector's piece is one of those examples where it's a tragic event, and the only way to really bring about the cost of that event is to tell the story of the life of the person who's lost. And I wonder, is it the height of naivete to believe that we can begin to create a society the likes of which we would want to live in by imagining the things we've lost, imagining the things that are in front of us, and basically imagining the spaces around violence rather than the end result of violence. Do you want to?
I think we have this beautiful tool, this beautiful form of art called the book. It's very cheap. $16 for entertainment that will last you 2 or 3 weeks, depending on, and it's very democratic. Of course, there's the problem of literacy, but I know that my career as a writer has been one of attempting to get into a bookstore like this one, books on the shelf that tell the story of my community in a more complex, truer way. And I know that that is empowering to lots of readers, because now I teach and I see them come into my classes. And it's extremely empowering to someone to see a story like theirs reflected in literature. And so my novels, especially my first novel, which was my MFA thesis, The Tattooed Soldier, gets assigned in classes all over the place. And it gets assigned to young Latino kids in community colleges or UCLA and many different places as the story that tells a story of violence, of the origins of that violence in history. And it's a tool, it's a teaching tool. And I think that to me is the total justification for what I do as a writer, beyond what I'm trying to accomplish personally, artistically, is this communication. I came into this bookstore, this very bookstore. My writing career started in this bookstore when it was called Chatterton's in the 1980s. And I was this young working class kid. I grew up in what's now called Little Armenia, East Hollywood, not too far from here. And I had a really poor public school education, but I felt the calling of literature. I was already then a reporter for the LA Times. I wanted to write literature, and I came here, and I found Don DeLillo. And I found this incredible new translation of Don Quixote by Edith Grossman that I love and recommend to everybody. And that empowered me as a storyteller. It sort of gave me, it sort of taught me that my experience was connected to all these other human stories from the 16th century or from the Bronx in the 50s or 60s. And so to me that is one of the things that gives me hope is just the humanities, just the practice of the humanities. For us as craftspeople and as readers, as an audience, as critics and editors, literary culture is a bulwark against the most deadening aspects of inequality.
Garnette, how do you reflect community? One of the first, this is the 4th or 5th piece I've published of Garnette's, and the first one was in an anthology about New York City and inequality called Tales of Two Cities, and he walked from the richest zip code in the United States to the poorest zip code. Wow. And why don't you describe the piece, because that kind of juxtaposition is shocking in and of itself, but the way you went about it was really phenomenal, because you found on the Upper East Side forms of community impoverishment through the symptoms of wealth. And then when you arrived in the Bronx, you found riches on the street that the Upper East Side was depriving itself from. And I wonder if you can describe that.
One of the hard things about writing about inequality is the ways in which people have retrenched into their own views of the world and are not particularly amenable to others. So, people said, it reminds me of I used to be the president for an organization in college called 10 Men Against Rape. And I remember somebody writing an op-ed criticizing me and said, great, these guys are against something nobody could possibly be for. And it feels like the writing on inequality is like that people are like, great, so you're against inequality, who is for it? But suddenly what has happened is there are ways of seeing the wealthy or ways of seeing the poor that have reduced them. And one of the reasons we write is try to remind people how irreducibly complex people are. But in the conversation about inequality, we somehow have taken on one or two dimensions. So I wanted first to remind people what it meant to be human, to be full of contradictions, and the way in which irony shoots through all of us. The second thing is that I had Auden, as he's so often, hovering over me. That poem, As I Walked Out One Evening, where he said, love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. And to be reminded that whatever side of the financial divide you're on, you had virtues, you had vices and faults. And so the other thing I wanted to do was to reverse the center of gravity. That when we spoke about this, it was always the Upper East Side was accessible to you. There's a whole world of literature, Edith Wharton, onwards of the Upper East Side, or Manhattan being this accessible place, and the dark was like this black box. You didn't know what happened there. And so I also wanted to play with that, to suddenly make the Upper East Side seem like this closed world that we had, no idea, what was going on. And then the Bronx, this transparent world. Because it also was, there's all this crunch, and I also wanted to take away to take the data, because so much of inequality, the discussion felt almost like a data dump, and this is not to criticize it, but like 27 people earn just as much as half, and so it sort of felt too abstract for others. And so, for instance, one of the things that happen with poor communities is the ways in which their lives are accessible. That the state imposes an accessibility on you. That if you're on, welfare, if you're getting public assistance, they can ask who's sleeping at your house, who are your lovers, what have you done with your days. You have to give account for every single part of your private life. And so what that has actually also done, in one way, it makes people cagey when you want to ask them about their lives, but it also has made them more open to their lives. There's a way in which there's an accessibility you have going into the Bronx, because of that. But also, I wanted to push against this idea of the poor, that in arguing or writing about or fighting for the poor, people were often condescended to them. It's like, oh, the poor, their awful lives. And I wanted to show the ways in which inequality was also an awful thing, not merely because of financial reason, but because of cultural and psychological and personal, because of the ways in which it diminished us as being human. And headlong into that with that observation that Frederick Douglass made, which Baldwin repeated in Fifth Avenue Uptown, that there's no way to degrade someone else without degrading yourself. And so the way in which inequality actually dehumanized us all. And so I chose instead to show the ways in which the wealthy's lives were closed, and there's a kind of luxury that came from the wealthy, but also the ways in which they were depriving themselves and depriving us of things because of that, the ways in which we're fully access the important parts of their humanity. But I also wanted to show in which the poor didn't need our condescension, that there are ways in which we were impoverished because of our lack of contact with them, because of the ways in which they didn't have access to the public goods that we had. And so I walked from the wealthiest to the poorest, partially to flip the categories by which we thought of things. But then suddenly the poor became more mysterious to us, and then the poor became at once more mysterious but also more accessible to us, and the same with the wealthy. But then everybody became fully human at the end of it, and so you didn't make it easy for you to retrench in the ground that you once did.
Diego Garnette just talked about abstractions when it comes to social issues, and I wonder, when you're reporting a story, are you following discrete individuals, and then they become part of a larger theme or thread that people are following within society in the news, or are you following the thread and then find the people who tell the story of that thread?
Sí, en hablando de la desigualdad, sí, cuando comienzas a escribir encuentras personas que tienen algún aspecto así abstracto, algún aspecto que quieres hacer que puedes usar para un comentario, o si es al opuesto, ¿no? Si vas y si tienes si encuentras algo, una cosa que quiere decir una realidad y buscas a las personas para contar esa realidad.
Sí. Bueno, yo muchos años trabajé en el diarismo haciendo notas todos los días.
Many days I worked in daily newspapers, writing stories every day.
Y digamos que en ese tiempo yo estaba muy condicionado al azar. A veces seguía a una persona, a veces un movimiento, un grupo social.
And in those days I was very much conditioned by chance. I'd follow a person or a movement.
Pero creo que el momento que me hizo a mí tomar la decisión de dejar el diarismo y de escribir con mayor profundidad.
And the moment that I decided that I would leave behind daily journalism and begin to write about issues with more profundity.
Tuvo que ver con una insurrección que hubo en un estado pobre e indígena de México que se llama Oaxaca.
It was when there was an insurrection in a very poor community, very poor state of southern Mexico called Oaxaca.
Yo llegué como un reportero a cubrir una manifestación.
I arrived as a reporter to cover a demonstration.
Y 2 meses después, todos los poderes estaban exiliados, habían salido los gobernantes de la ciudad, y un grupo muy diverso donde había trotskistas, anarquistas, hasta stalinistas, gente de izquierda, un poco también de centro derecha, tenían el control de la ciudad.
This was 2 meses o dos semanas.
2 meses después.
And 2 months later, after I arrived, suddenly all the officials in this town, all the government offices were held by this group of leftists, of Trotskyists and Stalinists, and all these different groups of leftists.
Y contrario a la historia latinoamericana, donde siempre hay un caudillo, que puede ser Fidel Castro, su comandante Marcos, aquí no había un líder, era una asamblea, un movimiento colectivo.
And running against a whole tradition of Latin American history that the person who rises to power in such an instance is a caudillo, is a strongman. In this particular place, the collectivity ruled this, es una ciudad, un municipio, ruled the city.
Ese momento para mí fue un privilegio como periodista haber atestiguado ese levantamiento de los pobres, esa insurrección, y me hizo también entender el reto de poder narrar un movimiento colectivo y no buscar, como buscaban todos los medios siempre, traducir todo ese movimiento a una sola persona, a un líder, sino en la diversidad.
And so that taught me, the great challenge of writing about that was that it taught me that I needed to write about the collectivity and not do what the rest of the media was doing, which would be just to write about one leader of that movement, but rather to write about the community as a whole.
Ustedes saben que en nuestro continente, que es un continente, como se ha dicho aquí, lo ha dicho tu compañero y Héctor, es un continente desigual, salvo Estados Unidos y Canadá.
As you know, in our continent, which is a continent of great inequalities, salvo Estados Unidos, incluyendo Canadá y Estados Unidos.
No, salvo bueno, pero son digamos, democracias con una clase media más.
Yeah, with the exception of Canada and the United States, the rest of the continent has this incredible inequality.
Solo ha habido 3 revoluciones, que son la mexicana de 1910, la cubana de 1950 y la nicaragüense de 1939. Por lo demás, el continente se ha mantenido en esa estructura desigual.
And so in that whole area, in this whole area of the West, there's only been 3 successful revolutions: the Mexican Revolution of 1910, the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979, and the Cuban Revolution of 1969. And the rest of the hemisphere has been kept in the state of inequality.
Y estamos ahora en una era en la que este siglo se ha dicho que ya no van a existir revoluciones en América, y a mí me tocó ver una semilla. Eso para mí fue un momento muy bello, muy inspirador, aunque lo que vino después fue terrible.
And supposedly in this era when we're not going to see any more revolutions, I saw this seed, this small seed of a revolution, and it was really, really beautiful to see that. Of course, then what later came was awful, was terrible.
Me tocó presenciar el asesinato de 2 personas,
I was present as the witness of the assassination of 2 people,
incluyendo un camarógrafo norteamericano, Brad
including a North American cameraman, Brad
Will,
Will, see?
que estaba grabando con su cámara
He was recording.
ataque de los paramilitares.
He was attacking he was taking photographs. He was shooting an attack by a paramilitary unit.
Cuando fue asesinado,
When he was assassinated.
y su caso sigue impune al día de hoy.
And no one has ever been punished for that killing up to today.
Y la insurrección fue aplastada.
And the insurrection was squashed.
Después de eso, ha sido difícil para mí encontrar un movimiento que pueda volver interesante para mí escribir acerca de él, y por lo regular son personajes, líderes.
And since then, it's been very hard for me to find a movement to write about, because usually what I have to write about are individuals or leaders.
Me tocó entrevistar a Evo Morales,
I interviewed Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez, Hugo de Marcos, many personalities.
Ninguno se compara con este momento de la
But none
colectividad
compares to this movement, this collective movement in Oaxaca.
de gente anónima, gente que vive ahora.
People who are anonymous, who live now. Yes.
Hector, I was in Vancouver 4 days ago with Diego, who made a compelling point that a great deal of the violence which has afflicted, is not the right word, besieged Mexico due to narco trafficking has been unleashed since the change in the style of government into the 20th century as it became a democracy. And you made it, Diego, a startling point that maybe democracy has some problems with it. Not democracy is messy, as our ignoble former Secretary of Defense described it. Hector, you've spent a lot of time reporting here. You traveled. He has a beautiful book called Translation Nation, which is a kind of de Tocquevillian journey around the United States into Spanish-speaking communities, in which he takes what is made invisible by popular culture and shows its vibrancy. And yet many of the people you speak to are struggling with terrible forms of disempowerment. And yet there's also great joy, and there's, DJs in Salt Lake City, who you would never even know to some degree if they were a Latino. Anyway, what I want to ask you is, do you ever have doubts yourself, especially now in this country, about democracy, not as a form, but rather what it has become, and how would that affect your writing if you began to feel that way?
I come from a very optimistic family. My parents were immigrants from Guatemala, and there was illiteracy in my past, and so my own personal journey is one from illiteracy to writing books. So I'm a very optimistic person, but to me, what is really the most difficult thing to witness, because I'm a product of the LA Unified School District, is what's happened to public education in our lifetimes, and sort of this libertarian thread of American society gradually eating away at social investment, and just to see the cruelty of that is a very difficult thing to see. On the other hand, I am really just excited by what I've seen in my lifetime happen in my own hometown, Los Angeles, and especially in the Latino community, in terms of just all these new forms of expression. A little bit like what both my fellow panelists here have talked about, of just seeing the just infinite number of ways in which so-called ordinary people find ways to feel powerful or to express themselves, to create institutions. That's sort of what I've been doing for 25 years, is collecting these stories of people who just create new things, new marches, parades, new galleries, new zines. It just never, the flame never seems to go out. And I see it also now as an instructor who's worked at 2 different public universities, is to have that incoming freshman class of 18-year-olds, and they're also idealistic, and they see the whole world of learning before them, and they just want to. Many of them, not all of them, just want to sort of soak it up. And so I'm optimistic. I think, to me, one of the great things about having been raised in the United States was how big the middle class is in comparison to other countries. Because the middle class is this very, very important, it's sort of like the beating heart of democracy. And so to me, I'm worried about the middle class, but at the same time, I'm proud of what I've seen the middle class accomplish, in my lifetime. I mean, people are so much more comfortable in my orbit, at least, as a middle class person, with cultural diversity than I can even remember when I was a kid. So there has been a lot of progress made, and so even though we're living in these incredibly dark times, and even though we have something as horrible as what's happening with the 14 million undocumented people in this country who are de facto members of the American civic culture, and yet are denied basic rights and are basically being treated as slaves. People who we accept their labor, and yet we don't want to give them rights. And that, of course, America has a long tradition of that. That to me is very frightening. That this condition, this sort of state of the undocumented, which I thought I would see some major immigration reform now in my lifetime. Now I'm beginning to sort of doubt that will happen. But I believe our institutions are imperiled. Our institutions are very weak. Our institutions have been undermined by many, many different kinds of things. And so I'm worried about our institutions, but I continue to have faith about the resilience and the resourcefulness of working people.
I want to ask you a follow-up question and then go to Garnette. The question I think this state of affairs prompts us to ask is the United States a civics experiment, or is it a business experiment? And when you think of the fact that, as Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, the lives of several million people kidnapped to this country were the down payment for American democracy. And as much as you're speaking of the sort of civil rights of undocumented workers, they're here for their sort of economic value as workers, and yet they're not recognized as people. And I wonder, as a storyteller, what can you do to sort of tilt us towards the civic experiment side without becoming a propagandist? Is it, in your case, simply collecting stories and showing that they're more than quote-unquote social capital? Or is it something beyond that?
Well, I mean, I've always populated my books, be they nonfiction or fiction, with people who are like my dad. They're sort of peasant intellectuals. My father to this day reads a book a week and reads Einstein, biography of Einstein, and he's somebody who had a 4th grade education. And so, I think I think that's a truth of the world that we live in. It's a truth of this. It's a truth of all capitalist societies have produced those kinds of people. Not because capitalism produces that, but because that's part of the cultural foundation on which capitalist societies were built. I've been reading recently, very slowly, James Joyce's Ulysses. And here's a portrait of a working man's sort of, kind of intellectual, but not really entirely intellectual Dublin, and just the richness of the street life and the richness of the interior life of the characters. And, Joyce himself was someone from a very, very poor family, a family that was really dysfunctional. And I just feel that that's sort of just part of it's this other side of what comes. It's not a product of capitalism, but it's something that has endured and found ways of thriving in capitalist society. And I believe capitalism should be destroyed. I guess still, I used to be a Trotskyist, but I still feel that that these ways of being human have ways of enduring, and so I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it's in some ways it's a question that prompts other questions,
Yes.
And by reaching to literature, I'm fascinated by the fact that you, instead of going to Upton Sinclair or something, you go to James Joyce. And Garnette, the first thing you did after you survived this period of your life, adopting the Anansi figure, is you started to go to school, and eventually you found yourself working in a bookstore like this, reading your way through the shelves almost at random. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about stumbling on Kazuo Ishiguro, who recently won the Nobel Prize, and what that meant to you at the time. Because I think one thing we're talking about is not just the importance of recording stories and being an observer and an engaged observer, but finding different frameworks for being human that resist the framework that's being put upon us by our societies, which is you are undocumented, you don't have rights, or you are a victim, you are simply only traumatized. You are poor, therefore your life is only known to be poor and sad. And what I find, and what all of you are saying, is that if you acknowledge complexity, there are possibilities as dark as the reality that you're reporting within seems. And what did Ishiguro mean to you at the time when you found him?
Well, I didn't read until I met Ishiguro when I just began reading. So some of it's taken on. The feeling you have when you just take on a new hobby or head to a new city, that the earliest encounters, some have this deeper meaning to them. The person who introduced you to the streets of LA somehow has a resonance in your memories, or when you make your way down routes of nostalgia, or memory meets experience, that person looms much larger than just about anyone else. That the way in which I enter the scene allows them to dominate the rest of the story. So that is part of it with Ishiguro, but part of it was also, I had grown up in a home in which I just began reading as a kid, Enid Blyton and Nancy Drew, which, if you don't know, are like champions in so-called third world countries. You talk to just about anybody from Africa or the Caribbean or Latin America, they will tell you like, oh, Enid Blyton, we're down. Like an enterprising editor should ask Chimamanda to write a piece about
I don't know any enterprising editors.
Yeah, Enid Blyton. And so, but my stepfather, being who he was, thought it just proved that I was gay and being brutally homophobic, and you have to admit that also in a society that itself was brutally homophobic, he would drive me out of the house by force and saying, go out, stop being gay, go do what boys do. And so at some point it sort of was shut down, and books became excluded from my life. And then of course there was the 1980s, there was Michael Jackson and Grandmaster Flash and Mel Mel and all these people asking to be danced to, and break dance became a part. So books are sort of left. And then later on in college, when I came to books, almost by accident, I came to the back door of photography, that I wanted to learn to shoot and observe and see the world, and I had to read to learn to do that. It opened the door for reading, and I dropped out of college. So I'd been doing physics, and I was a double major in computer engineering and physics. End of my junior year, I asked to transfer, and it's a very Jamaican way of responding. They said, you're doing computer engineering and physics, and you want to move to English and literature. And I said, yeah. And I said, we think you're having a mental breakdown. So you should go see the university psychiatrist, and if she clears you, we will give it a transfer. I head to her, and she sends back a report which said, I see no clear mental problems, but he has fantastic dreams that should not be indulged. And so I dropped out and then began working at this bookstore. And unlike American bookstores where there's this it's almost this romantic discussion about American bookstore. People working in the bookstore here who are lovers of literature and, wanted to leave with as many books as possible and introduce you to the lovely world of literature. The bookstore that I worked in Jamaica, like you'd walk in, the first sign you see was like every single shelf and huge in the bookstore said, no reading. And then you had a security guard who was hired, and the security guard's job was to prevent people from reading. And so you'd begin reading, and he'd sort of hustle up right beside you and said, do you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and eat a bucket before you decide if you're buying it? Then don't read the book before you buy it. Buy the book and read it if you want it, but don't read before buy. It's not taste and buy. And so he would do that. And so I was in a place in which, a bookstore in which nobody read, and the books weren't selling, and they couldn't understand why. And so I just, began making my way through and reading. And then they had a sale, and so of course they were selling Kaja Ishiguro, because in a Jamaican mind, or like the Jamaican mind then, I'm sure things have changed a lot since, but in Jamaican mind then is like, why would I want to read a book about post-war England by a Japanese dude? That makes no sense. Give me Dickens. Dickens writing about England, that makes sense. But Kazuo Ishiguro about a British butler, come on, man. And so it was on sale, like pretty much a giveaway for like nothing. So I actually bought Kazuo Ishiguro first because it was so cheap, because we couldn't get anybody to buy a book about a British butler, written by a Japanese author, as far as we're concerned. And I entered with a little bit of that bias, well, more than a little bit of that bias. But then again, as I said about reading, it's a way of like slicing time. The way he sort of like sliced them and pull you in, and you were just drawn into this different world, and these the ways in which you went across time and met somebody else in their full humanity, and then got pushed back out of that time and time sewn back up, and you felt that your own humanity had expanded, your own dignity had been enriched, your own understanding, your own empathy had been plumbed even deeper. And so he became the first author in I read. So I said I wanted to get more Ishiguro, and of course all the books were on sale, so that made it easy. And so I went through one after the other, Paleview Hills, Artists of the Floating World, and then Ishiguro just opened this whole universe where it went from him to Wallace Stegner to Dickens to George Eliot and of course it was something like being in your 20s and going, oh my God, The Great Gatsby is amazing, and people were looking like, yeah, we knew it at 11, or also to like come to Shakespeare in the late 20s and then understanding why my neighbor's mother really hated me, because I'd written all these love poems that I wrote on my own when I was 13, and then I was at 25, 26 discovering, oh damn, I'd plagiarized Shakespeare and didn't even know it. No, one of them mother thought I was a liar. I was like sending these Shakespearean sonnets, thinking, of course, nobody knows who this guy is. I can get away with it. But it just opened this whole world, and so that world of reading. And I actually became a writer partially because I wanted to continue being a reader. It was a way of extending that world of being a reader and wanting to meet people in these richer, more full humanities, which itself would make my own humanity richer and broader.
Yeah.
And deeper.
So Ishiguro was your starter drug.
Yeah, here's my intro into
Hector,
reading.
your novel Barbarian Nurseries, which is one of my favorite novels of the last 10 years. Basically, a couple is splitting up. One goes to a spa. The other one, I think, is just kind of having a breakdown and playing video games. And as a result, the domestic worker has to find a way to get these children that she's looking after safe, and so she does a kind of odyssey across LA. It would be a great film if anyone writes films. But my question is, I was living in England when that was published, and that book was published there, and it was. I saw it everywhere, and I always wondered what someone would think of LA picking that book up in Holland Park in West London, after sort of wiping the hangover off their face and getting out of their 19-year-old Jaguar. And hello. I wonder if you can, if there is a story in your life of someone finding one of your books to be a starter drug for them that surprised you.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you. I'm impressed. You read so much, you can remember the plot of my novel. Even that made my evening, you know.
It's a great novel.
But you know, I wrote this novel. I was telling you about the tattooed soldier, and it's about the Guatemalan genocide. It's mostly set in Los Angeles, and it's these two refugees from the war in Central America who are on opposite sides of the war. So one is a political refugee whose wife and son were killed, and the other one was a death squad soldier. And they meet in the streets of LA, and there is a confrontation during the 1992 insurrection or riots, in which one character faces off and the other. So it's really about the war in Guatemala and about inequality in LA, you know, and so as I said, it was, you know, it's assigned to lots of Latino students, and that when I first sold that novel, it was to a little publishing house called Delphinium Books for $5,000, and it, you know, was reviewed in the LA Times, didn't really get much play, and but it was the professors at the community colleges who kept my book in print because they kept on assigning it. And I remember once, the first time I met this group of Central American students at Pasadena City College, and they wanted to meet me to talk about my novel. And so they were all like, you know, 19, 20 years old. And we were talking, you know, I was talking with them, and one of them said, you know, I'm from El Salvador, and this is the same story, you know, this is our story, Central America. And I told my father about your book, and he said, oh yeah, you know, I lived some horrible things in the war. And he says, I know, Dad, but you've never told me about them. And so they had never talked about this horrible experience that the father had during the Civil War in El Salvador and in Central America. And so the son says, well, I've read this book by this author, he's, you know, Central American like we are, maybe you could read it. And at that time, it's never been translated into Spanish, that novel, but it's been translated into French, but not into Spanish. And so this kid who's 19 gives the book to his father, and his father had never read a book in English before. He'd lived in the United States for like 20 years, but never read a book in English. My book it's a very accessible book, The Tattooed Soldier. So the father reads the book, and he finishes the book, and he turns to his son, and he says, son, now you know what I went through. And my entire career as a writer was justified just by that moment, you know, by this father and son suddenly understanding each other because of my book, and that book opening a conversation between them. And you know, it was just a wonderful moment. He started crying as he told me that story. I started crying, and he's always with me. That reader, he's always with me. He's the reason why, after many rejections of my second novel, I still tried to write books. Was for him, and you know, and for people like him. And so, yeah, it's amazing what literature can do with this little portable kind of way of communicating ideas and stories.
Final question for Diego. You know, one of the goals of this issue, some of the writers in it have not been translated into English. Diego's first book, his most recent book, the biography of Carlos Slim, will be translated into English, and Verso is publishing it. But your most translated language is Italian. Yeah. And I wonder if you have had an experience with the Zetas book or the Sinaloa Cartel book or any of your reported books. He wrote a book about a bus trip across the country that he followed, where people who had been victims of narco violence were kind of an awareness publicity stunt to say this is the cost of what's happening in Mexico, and he took that bus trip with him. Has anyone said to you from Italy or another country, I read this and this is our story too?
Si alguna persona en Italia, ¿no?, donde se ha traducido mucho su trabajo, ha leído alguna obra suya y ha dicho, esta historia es nuestra historia también.
Sí,
Yes.
Curiosamente, yo he recorrido casi toda Italia.
Curiously, I've been through almost all of it. I've been across almost all of Italy.
Giras parándome en cada ciudad durante un
Tours and
mes.
stopping every town for the course of a month.
Pero nunca he ido a Sicilia, que es el lugar donde suele haber esta evocación de que lo que se vive es muy parecido
But I've
a
never been to
México.
Sicily, where I've heard that there is this sense that what's lived there is very similar to what's Mexico.
La RAI, la televisión italiana,
The RAI, Italian radio and television,
mandó un periodista italiano y un equipo a mi tierra, Monterrey. para
sent a
acompañar.
journalist. RAI sent a journalist to my tierra, my land, Monterrey.
Y yo estaba muy emocionado, me acompañaron a viajar por la
I
ciudad,
was very moved by this. They accompanied me in traveling through the city.
pero después de 2 días era muy fastidioso escuchar todo el tiempo el asombro de los periodistas italianos que hasta el canto de los pájaros decían, así cantan los pájaros en Sicilia. Yo ya estaba un poco desesperado.
And after a couple of days, it was actually kind of irritating that the Italian journalists kept on saying, "No, those singing birds, they sing just like they do in Sicily."
Yo creo que lo que pasa en México no es algo solo mexicano, hay peculiaridades,
I think that what's happening in Mexico isn't just a Mexican phenomenon. There are specific things,
pero esencialmente está ahí lo más humano e inhumano en lo que contamos del país.
but essentially what's there is the most human and inhuman stories that we tell in our country.
Alguien me decía de esta historia del cóctel de camarones, que era muy parecida, por ejemplo, al Festival de la Langosta en Maine, que David Foster Wallace contó alguna vez.
Someone told me that this story of the shrimp cocktail is very similar to a story that David Foster Wallace told about the lobster festival in Maine.
Siempre hay paralelismos, a final de
¿Siempre hay
cuentas.
qué?
Paralelismos.
There's always parallel aspects to a story.
A mí me interesa hacer historias particulares de América Latina, que es lo que yo conozco, que es lo que yo he viajado, pero pienso que son historias que pueden entenderse en cualquier parte del mundo.
I like to tell stories of Latin American reality because that's what I know the best, but I think these are stories that can be understood anywhere in the world.
Well, it is such a pleasure to have Diego here all the way from Monterrey. Sonora. Hector from across town. Garnette from New York. The most ideal event would be to have all 29 writers here, and they range. One of them works the graveyard shift at a 7-Eleven in Tokyo and has won that country's largest literary prize, and yet that's still her day job or her night job. There's a former provincial policeman from China. There's 3 women writers from Argentina who are every bit as bold and dirty, frankly, as Roberto Bolaño. So if you're ready for a Latin American binge, there's a lot of that here. There's some writers you probably know, Dinah Mengistu, Ocean Vaughn, who's kind of the big debut in poetry, Solmaz Sharif, who was a finalist for her debut book last year, and there's lots more. And it's a real pleasure to have you guys give us a wedge of light, not just into this issue, but hopefully what it is moving against, which is the reduction of what it means to be human. And Hector, thank you very much for being here and being a bridge between this anthology and this one, and for doing all your great work. If you have a question, I'm sure they'd love to answer it now. Yes.
Do you fear the assassinations that many journalists have, or does your work float above being literary, float above the artist, float above the kind of threat that most journalists face next?
¿Temes los asesinatos que enfrentan muchos los periodistas, o es su trabajo es tan irónico que está más allá, más donde no te va a afectar la violencia?
Creo que cualquier persona que busca la verdad en México,
I think that any person who seeks truth in Mexico,
sea periodista, sea un abogado, sea un activista,
who's a journalist, an attorney, or an activist,
o sea una persona que es víctima de un crimen y quiere investigar ese
or someone
crimen,
who's a victim of a crime and wants to investigate that crime.
cualquier persona sabe que por buscar la verdad la pueden matar.
Any person knows that that searching for the truth can lead to your being killed.
Eso es algo que uno da por hecho.
That's just a given.
Personalmente, yo me protejo, tengo medidas de seguridad.
Personally, I
cada
protect myself.
investigación.
I have security measures I take in every investigation I do.
Hay lugares donde voy disfrazado de
There are
sacerdote
places that
o
I
de
go
monje.
wearing disguise as a priest or a monk.
Hay lugares donde tengo que ir definitivamente con guardias.
There are places where I have to go with guards,
Lo cual-
bodyguards.
Lo cual es un problema porque suelo escoger guardias pues muy jóvenes y muy amables,
And which is a problem because I choose bodyguards who are very young and friendly,
y parezco yo el guardia de ellos, ¿no?
and I seem like I'm their bodyguard.
Pero fuera de bromas es muy grave lo que está
But all
pasando.
joking aside, it's very serious what's happening.
Ni en Siria matan más periodistas que en México.
Not even in Syria do they kill more journalists than in Mexico.
En mi caso han matado a 3 periodistas amigos míos.
In my case, 3 of my friends, 3 journalist friends of mine have been killed.
A 4 los han secuestrado
4 of them have been kidnapped.
y yo he tenido que salir 2 veces del país por el alto riesgo de amenaza.
And I've had to leave the country twice because of the high risk of threats.
Sin embargo, el periodismo tiene más sentido que nunca cuando hay una situación como esta, paradójicamente.
But paradoxically, journalism just makes more sense than ever in a situation like this.
No, that's you. Yeah.
So very interesting. And can you know, one of the things I'm caught in is all the aspirational wealth and how that's morphing factual information, how that structurally blinds people from seeing policy that's not assisting them. All this aspiration, you know, the fact that we grow onto commodities and capitalism and purchasing things, this aspiration of maybe what we can place into other values, like education, for instance, or wisdom, or James Joyce. So what has happened on the east side of New York? What's happening in that zip code? I mean, what deprivations are they seeing? Because in light of all the aspiration that Americans have to buy things.
One of the things that I hope to do as a writer is to remove abstractions and have people more richly imagine the life of others, but also more thoughtfully consider their own. And there are many different ways of doing it. One thing that I've done with New York is that there's such a focus on the numbers, and it's such... New York can be like a butterfly on speed. That just as when you think like you've caught a snapshot of where it is, and it moves somewhere, and it moves with such velocity, sometimes a violent velocity. It's hard to get a snap. At best, you can only get snapshots. And so one of the things I did was that I was involved in a project as a contributor, but also the editor at large for this book called Nonstop Metropolis, which I worked on with my friend Rebecca Solnit and Josh Jelly Shapiro. And so we figured that everybody has a map, whether they're conscious or not. We all have maps, of where we are, different ways of moving in the world and seeing the world that we've mapped out. You come to, there are no kids yet. So I think, for example, I was telling someone about this map that somebody has. One of my colleagues, I teach at MIT, and there's a transportation specialist 2 doors down from me, and you go in his office, and there's like a huge poster that says New York City, because we want you to know where you're going. And there's that grid, and it goes Boston, because fuck you. I say the Boston roadway system. And one of the things that actually happens is that post he's a New Yorker, but the post is also a product of this clash of maps, that you're used to the grid and you come to Boston and you really think that somebody is just trying to screw with you, just trying to make your life so difficult and not have you get where you want to go. And so we all have that. We all have a way of being in the world, and when we enter somewhere new, we try to retrofit that onto the in a new place. And so I thought that maps were important part of telling stories. And I wanted to, we wanted to go back to the old way of maps, that not the grid, where the grid again is an abstraction that's supposed to fit everybody, but the story maps that say how you saw the world. And so we got at inequality by trying to find oblique ways to talk about it, to look at the ways in which inequality stretched and squeeze the culture in ways that turned it in a caricature or brutalized it. So the way, for instance, diversity and inclusion, which is a marvelous thing, has now become a way, because of inequality and because of the way all the immigrants are treated, it's now become a way to think of service industry. So think of this Indian writer now, that whenever he meets people, people say, "Oh, you're Indian, I love Indian food." And so his response is, "On behalf of Indian food, I thank you." That now when you think of someone Asian American, it's how can they feed me, or this narrowness of the model minority. And so inequality sort of made us then reduce the kind of roles that people have, the kind of ways in which we can see them. And so we have a map of Staten Island that's famous for its white flight, and the ways inequality worked with that. And so we found a common ground by looking at the Wu-Tang Clan, the one thing everybody in Staten Island can agree on that everybody loves. And then we mapped the Wu-Tang Clan and just different things they sung about, which is the best research project ever. That the task was to sit down and listen to the entire Wu-Tang catalog and then map different crucial aspects on it. But then we mapped the contribution that Chinese Americans made to Staten Island, and you saw phenomenal social effects, the ways in which they changed the nature of elderly care there, and tried to solve this problem of both partners in a household working, but at the same time trying to hold on to ways of family. And so we showed the ways in which inequality tried to undermine the family unit, but different ways of responding to it. And also we have talking about immigrants not as a group that is only there to serve you, to dance for us, feed us, clean for us. But then also, when we were mapping it, we were seeing from some of the Wu-Tang Clan songs, we were singing about people who were killed by police. And then we discovered quite by accident that one of the people that the Wu-Tang Clan sang about police, unlawfully killing a black man, was a block and a half from where Garner was killed. And so we started, recognizing that as we started looking at the way you start mapping city and looking at the kind of tragedies in city, looking at the aftermath of city, looking at one of the things that inequality does is that it has us continually moving in lockstep with ambition. That we don't have time to slow down and look behind. That we don't have time for a tragedy. After in a tragedy or in a pain, to sort of clean up and say nothing to see here, move on. And so the mapping was a way to slow down, to ask, what are the different ways that the culture has felt reverberations? What are the kind of scars that exist? And New York is marvelous in that way, in the way it wears its scars on its on its sleeve. And so to give a snapshot of these scars and then write about it, and to look at the ways that intersect with the ways that sharp inequality is thwarting us, and you see it coming to the shore. So I'm not sure that we necessarily solved anything, but at the very least what we did do is to let people see that inequality has deep cultural reverberations and effects, everything from the environment and climate change to the way the elderly are treated or cared for in the city, to me walking around New York City for 24 hours straight without sleeping, and to show how you could sort of see the world in a day in New York, but map the different complexities and the mysteries and the horrors and the pains that immigrants have to deal with, and to look at exclusion and isolation in a way that functions there.
Do you guys have that book here, Nonstop Metropolis?
It's right there.
You can. There's.
It's the last in the trilogy.
There's several of them. I think at this point we should probably.
Can I ask Hector a question? Let's do 2 more questions.
Yes, of course. There's 2 questions. Wait, there's.
No, everybody should ask.
Yeah. Why don't you ask your question?
I wanted to ask Hector and Garnette, as American writers in this cultural movement, do you ever feel like your value as a writer for sort of white editors is limited to your ability to write about inequality, or sort of
Yeah. No, It's funny that you asked that question because, well, for lots of reasons, I guess. Yeah. No, I'm really lucky because I've had the same relationship with the editor of my last 3 books. I've known him for, I've known him for 15 years now. And Sean McDonald, who's at FSG now, and he's just, I know I can write anything. I mean, I really just, any work of art that I could conceive, he'll look at it as a work of art. But I know that writers of color especially constantly confront the expectations of agents, especially literary agents who are these gatekeepers. And the literary agents give them terrible advice, all the time, the worst advice. And part of my, part of what I do now is I have the resource of having published 4 books and having written 5 because I wrote one that didn't get published. And I just finished my 5th book that's going to be published, and so having this experience I can share with people. I can be this other sort of this elder, this wise person who can say that advice you got is totally fucked up, and so I think that lots of writers feel that pressure. But I think that you have to have, as a writer, you have to have this, and every writer, of color, not of color, male, female, transgendered, whoever's a writer, you have to have this incredibly powerful sense of the uniqueness of what you have to say. And thankfully, I've always had that. I was a jerk as a kid, and, straight A student, and then, I've always been a jerk, and who believes what he has to say is important. And it's funny because now I'm writing a novel that I just finished it yesterday, and it's 180,000 words. It's too long, wow. And it's a story of a white man. And so for me, the challenge is, how do I turn this upside down every day? Because he's traveling around the world, and he's seen all these places in the world. It's a true story that I've novelized, and so I feel. What I feel is I feel the pressure of my colleagues, of my fellow writers, of all races. That's who I'm responding to. It's like, how do I make this a work of art that deals with the realities of our time, and that's true to who I am and what I want to say, and that's already enough pressure to have as a writer. To think about what the market wants, oh God, there's so many writers who do that, and it's just that produces so much bad writing, And after my last book, I was on many, many prize juries. I was like on 5 or 6 prize juries, and I get these boxes and boxes of books. And there was like, I'm not going to mention anybody specifically, but you could see, especially certain writers of color or certain publishing houses or certain editors trying to hit the same note that 2 or 3 other writers had hit, and it's like, oh my God, this is deadening, So yes, obviously I don't feel that because I've been working for 20 years to say what I want to say. I mean, I wrote my first novel, was a political novel, Latino political novel, violence and war, and the first editors and to read it, it's like, oh, but we want Julia Alvarez, we want Cristina Garcia, we don't want genocide, well, what does it have to do with me? So I had enough chutzpah, I had enough sort of sense of like what I wanted to say, my own personal mission, and also I was stupid enough, and stubborn enough, because just all of us have that quality of just being stubborn. That's what you have. That's like the most important thing to be a writer, is to be stubborn. That I don't, I still don't feel like I'm going to allow anybody to dictate to me. And in fact, the history of literature, I'm not saying that what I'm doing is great literature, but generally speaking, the history of great literature is built on the backs of those men and women who have raised a finger and said, I don't give a shit what you want me. It's like what you want me to write. I mean, one of my favorite writers to read now is this incredibly opaque writer, Clarice Lispector, Brazilian, who, yes, and you guys know her, It's like, and the fact that she has readers in the United States is due to literary culture, to new directions, to this culture, this small culture of translation, wonderful translation by Idra Novi, this poet. She translated a new translation. And so, it's like Clarice Lispector didn't give a shit. She wrote an entire novel about a woman in a room with a cockroach, And so if she can have those guts, then why can't I? And so that's sort of what I try to communicate when I talk to write. I don't know if that is sort of like answers your question.
I don't write for publications, I write for editors. And the reason, there are a number of reasons for that, but one reason is which I like to be seen as a writer, and I like to work with people who tries to unleash my imagination, but also, invites me to theirs and pushes me to, to remember my responsibility to the reader, because I'm writing for the readers. And so often, John and I, the things that we're working together comes out of him saying, "What's on your mind?" Or, many times, often we're having a drink and he goes, "Write that up, like you need to write that now," or like write that story. And so a bunch of the stories have come from that. An index of how many publications and many editors treat me. A few weeks ago, maybe a little bit of a month ago, I was like, "Oh damn it, my email is going to be overpacked." And someone's like, "What?" And it's like, "Come next week, come in a week after, it's going to be murder." I just got an email from One World, and so the galleys for Ta-Nehisi's new book is out, so I know what's going to happen. And he goes, "Come on." In the space of a week, over 100 inquiries from different people. "Hey, so I'm wondering, do you want to write about the new Ta-Nehisi book?" Or for example, when they announced this list of 29 writers, there was a mad rush from different people, but a mad rush to say, "So listen, I've been reading for the longest time, and do you want to write about," it's always something black. And so time and time again, I'm seen just merely as a body. People can't get past my body. I'm not seen as a mind. So I've had people say, "Oh, write about this." I said, "Listen, I want to write about the new collection of Louis Gluck's poems." And they're like, "Oh, you're so funny." I said, "No, I really want to write about the new collection of, the new Louis, No." And so over and over and over again, I'm reduced merely to a body. Right. That time and again, like just about everything having to do with incarceration or, if it has the word ghetto in it, or black and black crime, or like these are. I just get tons and tons. After a while, I started, I wonder if people think I'm doing like a sociology of crime, if I'm a sociologist. And so many editors, can't get past my body, and so many of them I will say no, and occasionally I'll say yes to a piece and give them something that they weren't expecting and try to push them, or sometimes I'm just plain frustrated and mischievous, and so I'll write a piece for an editor, and in it are all these like, what's the term that I'm working, like Easter eggs, they're like, it's laced with like, well, there's no kind of, but like it's laced with insults. So like I'll have like they're responding to them and they have no clue. So it's like, "Oh, I love this piece," and like there are things in the piece, mocking, or like somebody will write to me, and there was one recent editor who had suggested 14 different things, and they were all black books, and I kept saying no. And I made a joke and I said, "Well, I'm surprised he didn't ask me to write about Souls of Black Folk, to write the introduction." And he goes, "Actually, we thought of that for you, but it just went into production." And so I reckoned and said, "It's a wonder you know how to breathe," which is my mischievous line from that Bob Dylan song, "Idiot wind blowing this way, it's a wonder you know how to breathe." And he goes, "Oh yes, let's talk about like not breathing, like the Eric Garner." And it's like, but all of which is to say is that this happens frequently, and so most times I just say no, and I just try to find an editor who will say, "Tell me, like John, tell me what's on your mind." Somebody who's like, "I see a mind, actually, within this body, and I can see past the body, and allow me to, do it." And so sometimes it might be somebody with a publication, with 7 subscribers, and so you'll turn it back to the Times, with his 2 million readers to say, no, I'll write for the person who has 7 readers who will read me, but 7 people who believe that they have a mind and they're willing to read a mind, rather than 1.5 million who are looking at a body. And so I've many times had to turn my back at different wonderful financial opportunities because it came at too great a cost. There are other times I'll take the assignment and play with it and give them something that they weren't expecting, and they go, oh, maybe we will give it the Louis Gluck's poems to write about.
On that note, I should tell you that Diego's book that he's working on right now is about a poet.
Sí, sobre un poeta que está desaparecido.
A poet who has disappeared.
Yo cuando empecé a escribir, escribí un libro, mi primer libro, que es apócrifo, es un libro de poesía.
The first book that I wrote, which is an apocryphal story, is a book of poetry.
Yo tenía 18 años.
I was 18 years old.
Y hablando de editores, tuve un editor que era más osado que yo y decidió publicar unos pésimos poemas precoces.
And there was this editor who was even more, pig-headed than I am, and decided to publish these poems that were terrible and precocious, poems of mine.
Entonces conocí a este poeta.
And so I met this poet. ¿Cómo se llama?
Samuel Loyola.
Samuel Loyola.
Que parecía un vagabundo.
He was like a vagabond.
Pero yo leí su poesía.
But I read his poetry.
Y me di cuenta que yo no tenía nada que hacer.
He was a fantastic poet. He was an amazing poet.
Y decidí dejar la poesía y ser más prosaico.
So I decided to leave behind poetry and to be more prosaic.
Irme al otro extremo.
And to go to the other extreme.
Y cuando quise buscarlo para agradecerle eso que él no se había dado cuenta que me había hecho.
And when I decided to search him out to say, para agradecer, to thank him,
me di cuenta que él había desaparecido.
I realized that he had disappeared.
Mucha gente piensa que murió en la calle.
A lot of people think that he died in the streets.
Pero yo tengo pistas ahora.
But I have evidence that I have a trail that I'm following.
Por cierto, tomé un curso de detective.
And in fact, I took a detective course in being a detective.
Y tengo la sospecha de que está en España.
And I suspect that he's in Spain.
Con el mundo musulmán underground.
With the underground Muslim milieu.
Porque en el último escrito que dejó,
because in the very last piece of writing he left behind,
tiene un verso como epígrafe de un poeta.
He has like an epigraph of Irani, of a Persian Iranian writer.
Que dice, quien conoce a Dios,
that he who knows God,
guarda silencio.
Keeps quiet.
Y después de eso desapareció.
And after that he disappeared. ¡Qué historia! What a story!
Well, oh man. Wow. Okay. It was terrific talking to all of you. Thank you for listening. You might have some announcements. I think they'll sign books. If you have books by Hector, if you'd like them to sign copies of Freeman'S, there's a copy of this. If you would like to read about the United States as it is, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. Don't forget that you can listen to this and all of our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.